Right now, as you're listening to this, there's a part of your body that doesn't exist. But some people swear they can feel it. Not an arm or a leg, something stranger, a tail, a phantom appendage that was never there yet somehow registers in the brain as real. Neurologists have documented cases of people who experience sensations in a tail they never had, a limb that vanished millions of years before they were born. It sounds impossible, but here's what makes it even weirder. Every single one of us actually had a tail once. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Subscribe if you want, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments, and it's wild. Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Los Angeles at lights out, all watching the same thing. Between weeks 4 and 8 of your time in the womb, you had a tail, a real, actual tail. Complete with muscles, nerves, blood vessels. It stuck out from the base of your spine, visible and unmistakable. Then, somewhere around the 8th week, your developing body did something extraordinary. It reabsorbed it. The cells received a signal, triggered a self-destruct sequence, and the tail just dissolved back into your body. Most of it anyway. What's left behind is your coccyx, your tailbone, the ghost of what you almost were. Now you might think, okay, interesting biological quirk, evolution's rough draft showing through. But here's where the story gets deeper, stranger, more unsettling. Losing our tails wasn't free. Evolution doesn't work like an engineer with unlimited resources. It works like a desperate mechanic cannibalizing one system to keep another running. Every gain comes with a cost. Every adaptation leaves a scar, and the costs of losing our tails, we're still paying them every single day. That chronic lower back pain that plagues modern humans. The fact that childbirth is agonizingly difficult for our species compared to nearly every other mammal. Certain spinal defects that appear in human babies but almost never in tailed animals. These aren't random problems. They're the price we paid for walking upright on 2 legs without a counterbalance swinging behind us. Scientists estimate this happened around 25 million years ago. Our ape ancestors made an evolutionary trade. They sacrificed the tail, and in return they got something that would eventually change the entire planet. The ability to walk upright, to free their hands, to become something unprecedented. But that trade required restructuring the entire base of the spine, rewiring the nervous system, redesigning how the pelvis connects to the backbone. It was evolutionary surgery performed over millions of years with no anesthesia and no guarantee of success. Today, there are over 8 billion humans living without tails, and most of us never think about what we lost. But your body remembers. Deep in your DNA, in the architecture of your spine, in the phantom sensations some people still feel, the memory of that vanished limb persists. The story of how we lost our tails spans 350 million years, from ancient fish crawling onto land to apes swinging through prehistoric forests. It's a mystery that touches genetics, anatomy, evolution, and even mythology. And it starts in a time so ancient, so alien, that imagining it requires us to completely reimagine what it meant to be our ancestors. To understand what we lost, we need to go back, way back, not thousands of years, not millions. We're talking 500 million years into the past, to a world so alien it would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. A world where nothing walked on land, where no flowers bloomed, no insects buzzed, no birds sang. Just endless oceans, murky and green, teeming with creatures that would look like nightmares and miracles rolled into one. This was the Cambrian period, and in these ancient seas something revolutionary was happening. Your ancestors were learning to swim with purpose. They weren't much to look at yet. Small fish-like things without jaws, without scales as we know them today, without even proper bones. But they had something that changed everything. A muscular tail. A flexible rod of tissue running down their backs called a notochord. And along that notochord, segmented muscles that could flex and contract in waves, pushing water backwards, propelling the animal forward. This was the innovation that would define the next 500 million years of evolution. The tail wasn't just an appendage, it was an engine. The first biological propulsion system that could generate sustained, directional movement through water. Before tails, animals drifted or crawled along the seafloor. With tails, they could chase prey, flee predators, migrate across vast distances. They could compete for mates and territory. They could explore. Every vertebrate animal alive today, every fish, every amphibian, every reptile, every bird, every mammal, including you, descends from those early tailed swimmers. The tail was so fundamentally successful as a solution to the problem of movement that evolution has never really abandoned it. Even when it seems to disappear, as it did in apes and humans, the genetic blueprint remains, ready to express itself under the right conditions. Picture those ancient oceans. Warm, shallow seas covering most of the planet, coral reefs just beginning to form, and through this underwater landscape, your ancestors undulating through the water like living ribbons. The tail wasn't just for swimming forward. It provided stability, keeping them upright in currents. It offered maneuverability, allowing quick turns when predators attacked. In some species, it became a weapon, a club for stunning prey or defending against threats. In others, it developed into a sensory organ, detecting vibrations and chemical signals in the water. For hundreds of millions of years, life refined this design. Tails became more sophisticated, more specialized. Fish developed elaborate tail fins, some forked for speed, others broad and flat for acceleration, still others long and whip-like for precise maneuvering. The tail became the most variable part of the vertebrate body plan, adapting to every conceivable environment and lifestyle. Then, around 375 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. Some of your ancestors started venturing onto land, not permanently at first. Just brief excursions into the mudflats and tidal zones, probably fleeing from predators or pursuing prey. These early tetrapods, the first four-legged vertebrates, looked like fish with legs. And they still had tails, magnificent tails, powerful tails, essential tails. Because here's the thing about moving from water to land. It doesn't make tails less important, it makes them more important. In water, your whole body provides buoyancy and balance. On land, suddenly you're fighting gravity in a whole new way. The tail becomes a counterweight, a balancing pole that lets you move without toppling over. Watch a lizard run today, and you'll see the tail swinging side to side, counterbalancing the movement of the legs, allowing the animal to change direction without losing momentum. Your amphibian ancestors, the ones who left the water for good, kept their tails. Your reptilian ancestors, who conquered dry land entirely, kept their tails and made them even more elaborate. Some dinosaurs had tails so massive they could demolish trees. Others had tails with elaborate clubs for combat. Still others had feathered display tails that would eventually become the wings and tail feathers of birds. Before we go further, I want to pause here for a moment. Think about the vast stretch of time we're discussing. 500 million years. That's so long that continents have formed and broken apart multiple times. Species have risen and fallen in waves we can barely comprehend. And through all of that, through mass extinctions and climate catastrophes and radical environmental changes, the tail persisted. It worked. It kept working. It was one of evolution's most reliable solutions. And speaking of time, I'm curious. Where are you right now as you're watching this? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. It's fascinating to think that while we're discussing events from 500 million years ago, we're connected across the planet in this moment, scattered across time zones, all pondering the same ancient mystery. The same way our ancestors were once scattered across ancient seas, all carrying the same fundamental design. When mammals first appeared around 200 million years ago, they had tails. Of course they did. Long, flexible tails covered in fur. Tails that helped them climb trees, maintain balance, regulate temperature. Early primates, your direct ancestors from about 55 million years ago, had spectacular tails. Long, muscular appendages they used like a fifth limb as they navigated the forest canopy. These weren't vestigial structures, barely hanging on through evolutionary momentum. These were vital organs, as important as arms or legs. A primate without a functional tail in the Paleocene forests would have been at a devastating disadvantage. The tail wrapped around branches, providing security when all four limbs were occupied with feeding or grooming. It helped distribute weight when leaping between trees. It was a balancing tool, a climbing aid, a social signaling device. For millions of years, your ancestors kept their tails and refined them, made them longer, stronger, more prehensile. Some New World monkeys today have tails so functional they can hang by them indefinitely, freeing all four limbs for gathering food. The tail isn't just an accessory, it's integral to their entire way of life. But then something changed. And that change would echo through millions of years, creating consequences we're still experiencing today. Around 25 million years ago, in the forests of Africa and Asia, A group of primates began to lose their tails. Not through injury or disease, through evolution, through a genetic modification that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth. Your ancestors were about to make a trade. They would give up one of the most successful evolutionary innovations in the history of vertebrate life. And in return, they would gain something else entirely. Something that would eventually lead to walking upright, to freed hands, to enlarged brains, to language and civilization, and everything that makes us human. But the trade came with a price our bodies are still paying in ways you've probably never imagined. Right now, somewhere in the rainforests of Central America, a spider monkey is doing something you can't. It's hanging from a branch, suspended 150 feet above the forest floor, using nothing but its tail. Not gripping with its hands, not wrapping its feet around the wood. Just the tail coiled around the branch like a muscular rope, supporting the animal's entire body weight while it uses both hands to strip fruit from a nearby tree. That tail isn't just strong. It's precise. The underside has a patch of hairless skin, ridged like your fingerprints, that can feel texture and grip. The monkey can manipulate objects with it, almost like a fifth hand. Some researchers have watched spider monkeys pass food from tail to hand, using their tail as a temporary storage device while they reposition themselves in the canopy. This is what we lost. This is what your ancestors gave up somewhere along the evolutionary path that led to you sitting here reading these words with your distinctly tailless body. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand what we lost, we need to see what our primate cousins still have. And it's remarkable. Travel south from that Central American rainforest, down into the Amazon basin. Here you'll find howler monkeys, creatures whose tails are so powerful they can hang by them for hours. Not minutes, hours. While they sleep even. The tail wraps around a branch and essentially locks in place, the muscles and tendons designed to maintain grip without conscious effort. It's like having a built-in safety harness that never needs batteries. These tails aren't just strong. They're specialized beyond anything else in the mammal world. A howler monkey's tail can support its entire 15-pound body weight using just the last few inches of the tail tip. The vertebrae at the end are longer and more flexible than those at the base, creating what's essentially a natural hook. The muscles are arranged in opposing pairs that can maintain tension indefinitely, without fatigue. But strength is just the beginning. Watch a capuchin monkey move through the forest, and you'll see the tail doing something even more sophisticated. It's providing balance feedback in real time. As the monkey leaps from branch to branch, the tail acts like a dynamic counterweight, constantly adjusting position to keep the animal's center of gravity stable. It's doing calculus, basically. Continuous micro-adjustments based on momentum, body position, and wind resistance. Some primatologists have tried to calculate the computational load this requires. The brain has to track tail position, predict branch movement, adjust for body rotation, and coordinate all of this with hand and foot placement, all while moving at speeds that would terrify most humans. And it does this automatically, without conscious thought. The tail is essentially an extension of the animal's balance system, as integrated into its movement as your inner ear is into yours. Then there's communication. Primate tails are like billboards advertising emotional states. A ring-tailed lemur walks through its territory with its tail held high, the black and white bands visible from hundreds of feet away. It's saying, "This is my space, I'm confident, I belong here." When the same lemur feels threatened, the tail drops, curves inward. The message changes instantly. Squirrel monkeys go further. They have an entire vocabulary of tail positions. Tail curved over the back means relaxed, content. Tail straight out behind means alert, possibly alarmed. Tail tucked between the legs means submission or fear. Other monkeys can read these signals from across the canopy, coordinating group movement without vocalizing, staying quiet when predators are near. Some species even use their tails for temperature regulation. In the heat of the day, a spider monkey will let its tail dangle loose, increasing surface area for heat dissipation. On cooler nights, the same tail wraps around the body like a blanket, conserving warmth. The tail has specialized blood vessels near the surface that can dilate or constrict, fine-tuning heat exchange like a biological radiator. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about primate tails is their sheer diversity. Evolution didn't create one tail design and call it done. It experimented, creating variations optimized for different environments and lifestyles. The woolly monkey has a tail that's longer than its entire body, perfectly suited for life in the upper canopy where branches are thin and widely spaced. The tamarins have non-prehensile tails used primarily for balance, like a tightrope walker's pole. The colobus monkeys of Africa have long flowing tails that probably serve primarily for visual communication, their white tips visible even in deep forest shade. Each design tells a story about how that species lives, what challenges it faces, what resources it exploits. The tail becomes a window into an animal's entire ecology. And then there are the apes, your closer relatives: gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, gibbons. Every single one completely tailless, not reduced tails, not stubby remnants, nothing external at all, just like you. This is the puzzle that haunted evolutionary biologists for decades. Why would natural selection eliminate something so obviously useful? Monkeys use their tails constantly, gaining enormous advantages in mobility, balance, and communication. The apes gave all of that up. And they did it long before humans came along. Long before our specific lineage started making the changes that would lead to walking upright and building civilizations. Somewhere between 25 and 30 million years ago, the ancestor of all apes made a genetic change that turned off tail development. Every ape since then, every single one of the millions of individuals born over millions of years, has been born without a tail. This wasn't a gradual reduction. The fossil record suggests it happened relatively quickly, evolutionary speaking. One group of primates had tails. Their descendants didn't, but they must have gotten something in return. Evolution doesn't just delete useful structures for no reason. When tails vanished from our ancestors, something else must have been gained. Something valuable enough to outweigh all those advantages we just discussed. What that something was, and why it mattered enough to reshape the entire ape-body plan, that's where the story gets really interesting. But first, we need to understand exactly when and how this transformation happened. We need to visit the moment when our ancestors' tails began to vanish, vertebra by vertebra, generation by generation, until nothing remained but a handful of fused bones at the base of your spine and a genetic ghost that still haunts human development today. Now we need to talk about one of the strangest transformations in our entire evolutionary history. The moment when our ancestors stopped being tailed primates and became something fundamentally different. Because somewhere around 25 million years ago, deep in the forests of Africa, a change occurred that would eventually lead to you, sitting here, tailless and probably never thinking about what you'd lost. This wasn't a gradual fade. Not some slow whittling away of vertebrae over millions of generations. The genetic evidence suggests it happened relatively quickly. A single mutation that spread through a population of early apes, transforming them from tailed tree dwellers into something new, something that would eventually climb down from the trees and walk upright across the African savanna. The mutation happened in a gene called TBXT. Now, genes have boring names because scientists discover them before they understand what they do, and TBXT just stands for T-box transcription factor T. But what this gene does is anything but boring. It's one of the master regulators of tail development in vertebrates. Turn it on during embryonic development and you get a tail. Mess with it and things get interesting. For millions of years, our ancestors had functioning TBXT genes that worked exactly like they're supposed to. They built tails. Beautiful, functional, perfectly adapted tails that help them balance, communicate, and navigate complex three-dimensional forest environments. Then something changed. In 2021, researchers finally identified what happened. They found it buried in the genome of every human, every chimpanzee, every gorilla, and orangutan. A tiny insertion of genetic material called an ALU element stuck right in the middle of the TBXT gene. Now, ALU elements are weird. They're jumping genes, pieces of DNA that can copy themselves and insert randomly into the genome. Most of the time they're harmless, just genetic junk accumulating over millions of years. But occasionally, very occasionally, they land somewhere important. This particular ALU element landed in exactly the right place to mess with tail development. Not destroy it completely, which would have been lethal, but modify it, alter it, reduce it. The mutation didn't eliminate the TBXT gene, it just changed how it worked during a specific window of embryonic development. When researchers tested this mutation in mice, inserting the same ALU element into the mouse version of TBXT, something remarkable happened. The mice developed shorter tails. Not no tail, but reduced tails. exactly the intermediate form you'd expect to see during an evolutionary transition. Some mice had normal tails, some had no tails, and some had various lengths in between, depending on other genetic factors. This is evolution in action, captured in a laboratory. But here's what makes this story really fascinating. That mutation, that single ALU insertion, occurred once. One time, in one individual, around 25 million years ago. And from that single mutant ape, the mutation spread to become universal in all apes. Every human, chimp, gorilla, and orangutan alive today carries that exact same ALU element in that exact same location. Think about what that means. For the mutation to spread from one individual to an entire population, and then to all descendant species, it had to provide some kind of advantage. Natural selection had to favor taillessness over having a tail. But why? This is where the story gets complicated, because genetics can tell us what happened, but it can't always tell us why. We can see the mutation that eliminated our tails, but understanding why losing our tails helped our ancestors survive requires us to piece together evidence from anatomy, behavior, and the environmental conditions of Africa 25 million years ago. The leading theory involves a fundamental shift in how our ancestors moved through their environment. Picture the African forests of the early Miocene 25 million years ago. The climate was changing, becoming cooler and drier. Forests that had once been continuous were breaking up into scattered patches separated by more open woodland and grassland. Tree branches were getting thicker, sturdier, more horizontal. For a small monkey with a tail, this would have been challenging. Monkeys use their tails for balance while running along thin branches. They're built for moving quickly through dense canopy where agility matters more than power. But for a larger ape trying to move through more open forest with thicker branches, the equation changes. Our ancestors were getting bigger. Larger body size is advantageous in more open environments because it makes you less vulnerable to predators and helps you regulate temperature more efficiently. But larger body size and tails don't mix well. A tail that's long enough to be useful for a 50-kilogram ape would be enormously heavy and metabolically expensive. All that muscle and bone and nervous tissue, just dead weight hanging off your rear end. Instead, our ancestors began developing a different strategy for moving through trees. They started climbing vertically using their arms, hanging beneath branches rather than running along the tops. They developed what primatologists call suspensory locomotion, moving through the canopy like living pendulums, swinging from handhold to handhold. For this new movement style, tails weren't just useless, they were actually problematic. When you're hanging beneath a branch trying to reach for the next handhold, a tail throws off your center of gravity. It creates drag, swings around unpredictably, gets caught on obstacles. Natural selection would favor individuals who could move more efficiently, and efficiency meant reducing that unnecessary appendage. But the biomechanical explanation isn't the whole story. Losing our tails also required anatomical changes that would eventually make upright walking possible. When you remove the tail, the spine can shorten and become more vertical. The pelvis can broaden and reorient to better support the weight of the upper body. The muscles of the lower back and gluteal region can develop differently, creating the powerful hip extension that would eventually allow our ancestors to walk on two legs. This raises a fascinating chicken and egg question. Did we lose our tails because we were developing upright posture, or did losing our tails enable upright posture to develop? The answer is probably both, a feedback loop where each change reinforced the other. The ALU insertion provided the genetic variation, the changing environment created the selective pressure, and the resulting anatomical changes opened up new evolutionary possibilities. Some researchers think there's another factor that hasn't been fully appreciated: social signaling. Monkeys use their tails constantly for communication, positioning them in different ways to convey emotional states and social intentions. But our ancestors were developing increasingly sophisticated facial expressions and vocalizations. Maybe they simply didn't need tails for communication anymore, making the appendage redundant. Others point to thermoregulation. A tail is a large surface area for losing heat, which is great if you live in a hot climate but problematic if temperatures become variable. Losing the tail might have helped our ancestors maintain more stable body temperature as they moved into environments with greater temperature fluctuations. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Evolution rarely works through single causes. More often, multiple selective pressures align, each pushing in the same direction. until a mutation that might have been neutral or even slightly disadvantageous in one context becomes strongly advantageous in another. What we know for certain is that 25 million years ago, the genetic change occurred. And over the following millions of years, it spread through every population of apes. The mutation was fixed, became universal, transformed from a quirky variation into a defining feature of our entire lineage. By the time our more recent ancestors were navigating that genetic bottleneck 900,000 years ago, they had been tailless for 24 million years. The loss was so ancient, so completely integrated into their anatomy, that growing a tail again would have required not just reversing one mutation, but rewiring entire developmental programs. The door had closed, the tail was gone, but not entirely. Because here's where things get really strange. That genetic program for building a tail, it's still there in your DNA. Still lurking in your genome, still capable of being expressed under the right circumstances. And during the first few weeks of your existence as an embryo, it tried to build you a tail anyway. Here's something that'll keep you up at night, or maybe help you drift off into existential wonder. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's a small bone at the base of your spine, your cockage. Most people call it the tailbone, which is accurate in a way they don't fully understand. Because that little structure isn't just reminiscent of a tail, it's the architectural remnant of an appendage you actually had. Not in some distant evolutionary past, not in your primate ancestors. You, personally, had a tail. For about 4 weeks of your embryonic development, you were equipped with a proper tail, complete with muscle tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. It grew behind you as your body was forming, extending from the base of your developing spine, reaching outward into the amniotic fluid. At its peak, around week 5 or 6, your tail represented roughly 1/6 of your total body length. Think about that proportion. If you're 6 feet tall now, that would be like having a 12-inch tail. Not a stub, not a bump, a tail. But you never knew it existed because by the time you were 8 weeks old, still months away from being born, your body had systematically dismantled it, cell by cell, tissue by tissue. Your tail didn't fall off, it didn't shrink away. It was deliberately destroyed from within through a process so elegant and precise it almost seems orchestrated. The molecular machinery of apoptosis, programmed cell death. Every embryo follows this same developmental path. Around week 4 of gestation, shortly after the neural tube closes and the basic body plan begins to emerge, the tail bud appears. It's one of the earliest structures to develop, growing from the posterior end of the embryo. For several weeks, this tail develops just as vigorously as your arms and legs. It contains up to 10 or 12 vertebrae, the same building blocks that make up the rest of your spine. It has segmented muscles capable of movement. It has a complete vascular system bringing blood and nutrients. In every meaningful sense, it's a functional structure. Then around week 8, something changes. Cells in the developing tail begin receiving chemical signals. These signals activate genes that trigger a cascade of self-destruction. The process is called apoptosis, and it's one of evolution's most sophisticated tools for sculpting body forms. The cells don't die passively, they actively dismantle themselves from the inside out. Their DNA fragments, their organelles break down. The cell membrane begins to blister and form what scientists call apoptotic bodies, tiny packages of cellular debris that neighboring cells can easily consume and recycle. This happens in waves, starting from the tip of the tail and working backward toward the spine. One by one, vertebrae dissolve, muscle tissue breaks down, blood vessels collapse. The process is so thorough that by birth only 3 to 5 fused vertebrae remain, compressed into the small triangular bone we call the coccyx. Everything else has been reabsorbed, recycled into other growing tissues. Your tail provided raw materials for other parts of your body. The calcium from its bones went into your skull. The proteins from its muscles became part of your developing organs. But here's where evolution reveals its imperfect nature. Sometimes the process fails. Not completely, but partially. The genetic program that's supposed to trigger apoptosis doesn't activate properly, or doesn't activate completely. When this happens, babies are born with what medical literature carefully calls vestigial tails, or, in rarer cases, true tails. The distinction matters. A vestigial tail is essentially an extension of the coccyx, containing only cartilage and connective tissue. It's soft, usually immobile, typically just a few centimeters long. These occur in roughly 1 in 25,000 births. They're easily removed surgically and generally don't cause any functional problems. The child never knows what they're missing. But true tails are something else entirely. These are rarer, maybe one in several 100,000 births, and they're structurally complex. They contain actual vertebrae, extensions of the spinal column. They have muscles that can contract. They have nerve connections to the spinal cord. These tails can move. Babies have been documented moving their tails voluntarily, though whether this represents conscious control or reflexive motion remains debated. The movements are usually simple, side-to-side motions or curling, nothing like the prehensile sophistication of a monkey's tail, but they move. The medical response to these cases is almost always surgical removal in infancy. This isn't just cosmetic. A tail extending from the base of the spine creates practical problems in modern human life. Sitting becomes complicated. Clothing doesn't fit properly. And there's always the risk of injury. A structure extending beyond the natural contours of the body is vulnerable. But there's also a cultural dimension. We've spent 20 million years without tails. We've built our entire civilization on the assumption that humans don't have them. A visible tail marks someone as different in ways that society still struggles to accommodate. Yet the cases persist. They appear in every population, every ethnic group, every part of the world, because the genetic pathway is still there. The instructions for building a tail haven't been deleted from the human genome. They've just been switched off. But switches can fail. Mutations can occur. The precise timing required for apoptosis can be disrupted by developmental variations. And when that happens, the ancient program runs to completion, building a structure that our ancestors last used when they were leaping through tropical forests 50 million years ago. For the vast majority of us, the only remnant is the coccygeus itself, that small bone most people only notice when they fall badly or sit on a hard surface too long. It sits there, fused and forgotten, the compressed memory of something we once were. 4 or 5 vertebrae that once extended into a tail, now compressed into a structure barely 2 inches long. It still serves minor functions. Several muscles and ligaments attached to it helping support the pelvic floor. But mostly, it's just there. A bookmark in our developmental story, marking the place where our body decided to write a different ending than the one our ancient ancestors knew. Your coccyx is the ghost of your embryonic tail, a structure you grew for a few weeks before your own cells systematically erased it. And in some ways, that makes it the perfect symbol for human evolution. We carry our past within us, written in bone and encoded in developmental programs that still run their ancient routines. But we also carry the mechanisms that have modified that past, sculpted it, erased parts of it to make us what we are now. The tail you never knew you had is gone. But its foundation remains, silent testament to the body you briefly were, before you became the body you'd be born with. And that small bone at the base of your spine, it remembers. So your ancestors lost their tails. Problem solved, right? Upright walking, free hands, better survival in the grasslands. Evolution made the right choice. Case closed. Except it wasn't that simple. Evolution doesn't give you upgrades without taking something away. Every adaptation comes with trade-offs, compromises, hidden costs that don't show up until millions of years later when your descendants are trying to understand why their bodies keep breaking down in such predictable, frustrating ways. Losing our tails freed our hands, but it also broke our backs. Let's start with the most obvious problem. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's an 80% chance you've experienced significant back pain at some point in your life. Not just minor discomfort, real pain. The kind that keeps you awake at night, that makes simple movements excruciating, that sends millions of people to doctors every year searching for relief that often never comes. This isn't random. This isn't just bad luck or poor posture or too much sitting. This is a design flaw baked into the human body by the loss of our tails. Think about it mechanically. A tail isn't decorative. It's a counterbalance, a dynamic stabilizer that helps distribute weight and absorb shock. When quadrupedal mammals move, their tails adjust constantly, shifting their center of gravity, helping them maintain stability without putting excessive stress on any single part of their spine. Then we stood up. And we did it without the tail that would have made upright posture sustainable. The human spine wasn't designed for vertical loading. It evolved as a horizontal bridge, meant to hang between 4 support posts with weight distributed along its length. Our quadrupedal ancestors had it easy. Their spines were like suspension bridges, with muscles and ligaments providing tension from above and below, the whole structure working in balanced harmony. But when our ancestors went bipedal, that horizontal bridge got stood on its end. Suddenly all the weight of the upper body, the head, the arms, everything, was pressing straight down through vertebrae that had evolved for completely different forces. The lower spine, particularly the lumbar region and the sacrum, became stress concentration points, bearing loads they were never meant to handle. A tail would have helped. It would have provided a counterweight, a flexible extension that could shift the body's center of mass backward, reducing the extreme lordotic curve, that exaggerated arch in the lower back that modern humans need just to stay upright. Instead, we compensate with muscle tension, chronic contraction of back and abdominal muscles trying desperately to keep us from toppling forward. And we pay for it, constantly. But back pain is just the beginning. The genetic mechanisms that suppress tail development in our ancestors created a much more dangerous problem, a vulnerability that still kills and cripples thousands of children every year. Neural tube defects, spina bifida, anencephaly. Here's what most people don't realize. The genes that control tail development in embryos are the same genes involved in closing the neural tube, the structure that eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord. When our ancestors evolved to suppress tail growth, they were playing with incredibly sensitive developmental pathways, making changes to genetic programs that controlled not just the tail but the entire posterior development of the embryo. Most of the time, it works fine. Human embryos start developing a tail around 4 weeks, then it gets reabsorbed, broken down, and incorporated into the developing pelvis. The neural tube closes properly, the spine forms correctly, and the baby develops normally. But sometimes, something goes wrong. The genetic signals get confused, the developmental program stutters, and the neural tube doesn't close completely. The result can be catastrophic. Spina bifida leaves children with exposed spinal cords, paralysis, a lifetime of medical interventions. Anencephaly is usually fatal. These aren't rare conditions. They affect about 1 in every 1,000 births worldwide. That's thousands of children every year, casualties of the genetic compromise our ancestors made 25 million years ago. You can reduce the risk with folic acid supplementation during pregnancy, but you can't eliminate it. The vulnerability is written into our developmental program, a permanent reminder that evolution's solutions aren't always clean. And then there's balance, or rather the constant struggle for it. Watch a monkey move through trees. See how its tail acts as a dynamic stabilizer, constantly adjusting, helping it make split-second corrections that keep it from falling. Now watch a human trying to walk on a narrow beam. See how we wobble, how our arms flail, how we struggle to do what many tailed animals accomplish effortlessly. We compensated, of course. We evolved elaborate vestibular systems in our inner ears, expanded the cerebellum, developed sophisticated proprioceptive feedback. Our brains got bigger partly just to handle the computational demands of upright balance without a tail. But it's still harder than it should be. Elderly people fall constantly, a major cause of injury and death. Young children take months to learn to walk, far longer than most mammals need to master basic locomotion. We're working with a compensation system, not an optimized solution. Perhaps most brutally, losing our tails contributed to what anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma. Human childbirth is uniquely difficult, dangerous in ways that most mammal births aren't. Part of this comes from our big brains, but part comes from our reconfigured pelvis. When we went bipedal without tails, our pelvis had to change shape dramatically to support upright posture. It became narrower, more bowl-shaped, better at bearing vertical loads but worse at providing a spacious birth canal. The result: human infants have to perform a complicated rotation maneuver during birth, twisting and turning through a birth canal that's barely large enough. Labor is longer, more painful, and more dangerous than in most mammals. Maternal mortality from childbirth was a leading cause of death for women throughout most of human history, all because we needed a pelvis that could support upright walking without the counterbalance of a tail. And then there's the coccygeus itself, the ghost of your vanished tail fused into a small triangular bone at the base of your spine. Most of the time, you don't notice it. It just sits there, a vestigial remnant, serving minor functions as an attachment point for some pelvic floor muscles, until you fall on it, or give birth, or develop one of the various conditions that can make the coccage chronically painful. Coccydynia, they call it, tailbone pain. It affects about 1% of people at any given time, causing pain when sitting, standing up, or during bowel movements. Sometimes it resolves on its own. Sometimes it becomes chronic, life-altering, resistant to treatment. In extreme cases, surgeons remove the coccygis entirely, cutting away the last physical remnant of your ancestral tail. The irony is perfect. We lost our tails 25 million years ago. But the bones remain, just functional enough to cause problems, just vestigial enough to remind us of what we gave up. Evolution made a choice: hands or tails, upright posture or stable spines, the freedom to manipulate tools or the security of balanced movement. We got the trade we needed to become human, but we're still paying the price. Every aching back, every difficult birth, every moment of uncertain balance is a reminder that evolution's solutions are never perfect, just good enough to survive. And sometimes, barely that. So if losing a tail came with so many hidden problems, why didn't evolution just turn around and undo it? Why keep pushing forward on a design that gives you bad backs, tricky births, and ankles that roll if you look at a rock the wrong way? Because what we got in return was outrageous. We didn't just lose a tail. We traded it. Picture one of your early tailless ancestors 3 or 4 million years ago. Not quite human. Not quite ape in the modern sense either. Walking awkwardly on 2 legs some of the time, dropping to all 4s when things got hard, still carrying the ghost memory of a tail in its nervous system. To an observer from the trees, they probably would have looked wrong, unbalanced, exposed. The tail is armor against falling, insurance against missteps. These ground apes had given that up. But look again. Watch their hands. Because once your spine stops needing to be a rigid anchor for a tail, it can slowly re-engineer itself into something else. The pelvis tilts, the lower back curves, the center of gravity shifts over the hips. Step by small step, generation after generation, the body begins to do something no other primate had ever fully committed to. It stands up. Bipedalism wasn't an overnight revolution. It was a long, wobbly compromise. Knees knocking together, feet reshaping from branch grabbers into shock absorbers, the whole body rebalancing around a tail that was no longer there. But as soon as that posture stabilized, the payoff was obvious. The hands were free. Free to carry food over long distances instead of eating it on the spot. Free to hold infants while moving, allowing mothers to travel farther, faster, with their young. Free to steady simple sticks and stones at first, and then, very slowly, to shape them. A tail is a superb tool for climbing, for balancing, for signaling. But it is a single-purpose tool, hardwired into bone and tendon. A hand is a universal tool platform. Opposable thumbs, fine motor control, a brain increasingly obsessed with what those fingers can do. Every small improvement in upright walking made the hands slightly more available, and every improvement in hand use made upright walking more valuable. A feedback loop. Lose a tail, gain a toolkit. By the time stone flakes start appearing in the archaeological record, that trade is well underway. By the time fire shows up, the deal is sealed. Tail muscles that once twitched to keep you balanced on a branch have become part of a muscular system tuned to hold a child. Twist a spear, grind grain, chip obsidian into razor-thin blades. And it wasn't just about tools. Walking on 2 legs came with another quiet advantage: efficiency. Quadrupeds are great sprinters. They explode, they bound, they launch. But when it comes to slow, steady travel across open ground, the mechanics change. An upright posture lets the body behave like an inverted pendulum with each step. The center of mass vaults over the stance leg. Energy is stored and released in tendons and ligaments. The muscles can work more like springs and less like constant engines. On the savannah, where food might be scattered and shade might be miles apart, saving even a small amount of energy per step matters. Over thousands of steps a day, over a lifetime, over millions of lifetimes, it becomes a selection pressure. Individuals who could walk a bit farther on the same calories, who could carry food or water back to the group without collapsing, had an edge. They survived droughts a little better. They reached new patches of land a little more often. They reproduced. Over time, the skeleton recorded this shift. The pelvis became bowl-shaped. The femur angled inward. The foot grew arches to act like springs. The spine developed gentle curves to balance the head above the hips. All the while, the tail vertebrae at the base of the spine were shrinking into that tiny coccyx, no longer a propeller behind the body, but a leftover at the end of an increasingly specialized column. This energy efficiency opened the door to something even stranger: Endurance running. At first glance, humans are terrible runners. We're slow off the line. We have no claws, no fangs, no sprint built into our legs. But in terms of pure distance, especially in heat, the picture flips. Upright posture reduces the amount of body surface directly facing the sun. Our sweating system, combined with mostly hairless skin, turns the whole body into a radiator. Our long legs and elastic tendons can sustain a trot long after many quadrupeds have to stop and pant. Some anthropologists think this made us the greatest persistence hunters the planet has ever seen. Not cat-like ambush predators, not wolf-like pack sprinters. Something else. A creature that could pick an antelope out of a herd and simply follow, not fast, not dramatic, just relentless. Jogging in the heat of the day while the prey animal overheats, runs, stops to cool, runs again, and slowly runs out of options. After hours, sometimes after an entire day, the animal reaches a point of exhaustion so complete it can no longer flee. And the hunter, still moving at that same moderate pace, walks up and finishes the job with a simple tool. For that style of hunting, a tail is almost irrelevant. What you need is balance over long distances, a spine that can rotate and counter-rotate with each step, arms that can swing to stabilize you, and then deliver a precise blow at the end. The tail shrinks, the stride lengthens, the lungs and heart and sweat glands step in to do work no primate had done before. As bodies changed, minds had to catch up. Standing upright does more than change biomechanics. It alters perspective, literally. Eyes are higher off the ground. The horizon moves farther away. You can see over tall grass, spot predators earlier, watch the movements of distant herds. You can track the location of other groups, remember landmarks, build mental maps that stretch beyond the next tree. An individual who can plan a route to distant water, recall where fruit trees ripen at different times of year, remember which ravine hides shade even at noon, has a survival advantage. And to make those plans with others, to coordinate long hunts and shared childcare, you need more than gestures and grunts. You need more sophisticated communication, more memory, more social awareness. So as the skeletons of our ancestors reoriented around two legs, their societies were quietly reorienting too. Cooperation became more valuable. Sharing information became more valuable. Keeping track of who owed whom, who helped in the last hunt, who could be trusted with childcare, all became part of daily survival. The loss of a tail, the gain of a posture, cascaded upward into the architecture of the mind. Was this a loss then, or an exchange? On one side of the ledger, chronic back pain, tricky births, sprained ankles, spines that complain for decades after the reproductive years have ended. A whole list of vulnerabilities that trace back, in subtle ways, to a body that stands upright without the support beams four-legged animals enjoy. On the other side, hands that can build spaceships, legs that can cross continents, brains that can remember the moment a tiny tail bud appears in an embryo and vanishes and wonder what that means. Evolution doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about comfort. It cares, blindly, about what works just well enough to survive and reproduce in a particular time and place. For our ancestors, in their drying forests and expanding grasslands, a tailless, upright body worked. It let them walk farther, carry more, cooperate better, invent tools, and eventually, language, art, and history. We didn't simply lose a tail. We converted it. We folded its cost into a new design. A design that sometimes hurts, sometimes fails, but also allows a primate with a fragile spine and a tiny coccyx to sit up in the dark and tell the story of how it all began. Now zoom in, weigh in, past bones and muscles and nerves, past cells and organelles, down into the quiet, humming darkness of DNA. Because the real story of how we lost our tails isn't written in fossils. It's written in 4 letters, repeated billions of times, curled up in almost every cell of your body. Somewhere in that code sits a gene with a very plain name and a very dramatic job. TBXT. You can think of TBXT as a kind of ancient instruction manual. It tells developing embryos where to build the spine, how to shape it, how far it should grow, and, in most mammals, whether a tail should sprout from the end. Mice have TBXT, dogs have TBXT. Monkeys have TBXT. You have TBXT too. In tailed animals, this gene helps orchestrate a long chain of events during early development. Cells along the back of the embryo read its instructions and start building vertebrae like beads on a string. As the line grows, extra beads get added at the far end, curling out into a tail. In apes, something different happens. The string stops, the tail never appears. For more than a century, nobody knew why. We could see the embryos. We could see the tiny tail bud appearing in early human development, and then vanishing, absorbed back into the body like a ghost limb retreating into the dark. But we didn't know what changed in the code. Then, in 2021, a team of researchers decided to treat this like a cold case. They lined up the DNA of tailed monkeys and tailless apes like detectives spreading out old files. Baboons, macaques, gibbons on one side. Humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans on the other. They started comparing. Most of the genome looked the same. Same ancient blueprints, same developmental instructions. But when they focused on genes known to control the spine and tail, one difference kept showing up like a fingerprint at a crime scene. In apes, right in the middle of the TBXT gene, an extra piece of DNA had slipped in. A stowaway, a parasite, an ALU element. ALU elements are often called jumping genes, though technically they don't jump by themselves. They're little hitchhikers in the genome, short stretches of repeated sequence that can copy and paste into new locations. Sometimes they land in empty, harmless regions and just sit there, silent. Sometimes they jump into the middle of an important gene and scramble its message. Over millions of years, these jumping genes have filled our DNA with echoes of ancient insertions. They're everywhere. About 10% of your genome is made of them. Most of the time they don't do much, but once in some small-bodied primate, tens of millions of years ago, an ALU element slipped into TBXT, not next to it, into it. Imagine you're copying a recipe for a cake, line by line, and halfway through, somebody sticks in a paragraph about making soup. When the cook tries to follow the instructions, everything after that interruption gets confused. That's what happened to TBXT. In our ape ancestor, the gene still worked, but differently. It started producing a slightly altered mix of instructions, different versions of the same protein, in different ratios. The spinal cord still formed, the vertebrae still grew, but the tail program quietly failed. To test this idea, the researchers did something both simple and astonishing. They took that ALU insertion from apes and put it into the TBXT gene of mice. Nothing else. Just that one change. The mice still developed spines. They were still recognizably mice. They ate, moved, explored. But many of them were born with shorter tails. Some had barely any tail at all. One tiny genetic tweak. One extra sequence dropped into the middle of a gene shared across mammals, and the body plan shifted. This is the kind of precision and fragility that evolution works with, not grand rewrites. Tiny edits. A letter here. An insertion there. A jumping gene landing in just the wrong, or just the right, place. Now picture the animal in which this first happened. Not a human, not even an ape as we know them. Some early ancestor moving through the trees of an ancient forest, long before glaciers and bottlenecks and stone tools. Almost everyone in its species has a tail. They use it for balance, for signaling, for subtle adjustments as they run along branches. But one infant is born different. Maybe the tail is a little shorter, maybe it's more fragile. In many environments that might have been a death sentence. An accident the forest never hears about again. But environments change, behaviors change. Maybe this population is starting to move differently. Less time running along narrow branches, more time sitting upright on thicker ones, more climbing with hands and feet, less leaping through open air. In that world, the cost of a shorter tail might not be so high. And there might even be benefits. Tails aren't free. They take energy to grow, nutrients to maintain, time for the brain to wire up and control. They can be injured, grabbed, infected. A body that quietly drops the tail program might be able to invest more in something else. Stronger hips, more stable lower backs, different ways of moving. At first, the mutation would have been incredibly rare. One individual, one family, but that's all evolution ever needs. In small, scattered populations. The kind our ancestors almost always lived in. Genes can spread fast if they're even slightly helpful, or if they're just not harmful enough to be removed. Each generation, that ALU-tweaked TBXT gets passed on to a few more descendants. It drifts through the gene pool, rising and falling by chance, nudged by natural selection when conditions favor it. 1,000 years go by. 10,000. No one notices. No one has the concept of tail as something they could have had but don't. They just are what they are. A little more upright, a little more stable sitting on branches. Slowly, imperceptibly, less like monkeys and more like apes. From our perspective, millions of years later, it looks inevitable. Of course apes lost their tails. Of course humans are tailless. But from inside the process, it was anything but inevitable. It was a game of genetic whack-a-mole played over vast stretches of time. Mutations popping up, most of them disappearing, a few of them slipping through, leaving subtle traces in the body plans of future species. The TBXT mutation is one of those traces you can still see. In a human embryo, for a few fleeting weeks, the ancient program tries to run. A small tail bud appears, tiny vertebrae beginning to form, and then the altered instructions assert themselves. Cells switch off, the budding tail is reabsorbed, the ghost limb retreats. In mice with the engineered mutation, you can see the same story play out in fast motion. Same gene, same kind of insertion, same consequence scaled down for a creature that still insists on keeping its tail. Different species, different outcomes, same underlying logic, accidents that sometimes become advantages, random jumps that sometimes land in just the right place. This is what the genetics of tail loss teaches us about evolution. It's not a designer carefully redrawing blueprints. It's a restless process hacking away at the code, generation after generation, keeping whatever happens to work, discarding what doesn't. Your missing tail isn't just an absence. It's the fossil of an ancient mutation, preserved not in rock, but in the instructions that built you. And it's still there, running silently every time a new human life begins. By the time our ancestors were telling stories around fires, the physical tail was long gone. But the idea of a tail, that never disappeared. It just moved. From the backbone into the imagination. Across thousands of years, in cultures that never met, tails kept slipping back into our stories. Not as ordinary body parts, but as symbols, clues about what we fear in ourselves and what we secretly miss. In much of Western history, the tail became a kind of warning label, a sign that whatever wore it was not fully human, not one of us. When medieval Europeans pictured pure evil, they didn't imagine some abstract, formless darkness. They gave it a body, horns, hooves, and almost always a tail. The devil's tail in medieval art wasn't just a random detail. It was a message, a reminder that evil was bestial, animal, closer to the beasts in the forest than to the souls in the church. Many theologians and preachers of the time frame sin as a kind of falling backward, away from reason, away from self-control, back toward animal instinct. And in a world where most people had no idea how evolution worked, the tail was an easy way to picture that slide. Humans had no tails. Animals did. So if something had a tail, it was closer to the creatures that had to be ruled, hunted, tamed. There were even stories, rumors whispered on the edges of belief, that some sinners, or some distant, barbaric peoples, were born with tails. Not many people truly saw these supposed tailed humans, but the tail persisted. Because it wasn't about anatomy. It was about drawing a line between civilized and wild, between us and them. Witches were caught in that same symbolic net. In some medieval and early modern witchcraft lore, the witch's pact with the devil was marked on the body. A strange birthmark, an extra nipple, a hidden spot that didn't bleed. Occasionally in the more lurid imaginations, a tail. Small, concealed, something they could supposedly hide under their clothes. A trace of their allegiance to the demonic, to the animal, to the forbidden. Whether or not anyone actually believed witches had tails wasn't the main point. The fear behind it was clear enough. Underneath ordinary human skin, there might be something else. Something older. Something that hadn't fully let go of the beast. But not every culture treated tails as a mark of shame. If you look east, the symbolism shifts. In Chinese and Japanese folklore, for instance, tails often belong to beings that are dangerous, yes, but also wise, powerful, even divine. Think of the fox spirits, the huli jing in China, the kitsune in Japan. The more tails they have, the more ancient and powerful they are. 9 tails doesn't mean more animal. It means more magical, more knowledgeable, more aware of hidden truths. In Hindu traditions, one of the most beloved figures in the entire mythology is Hanuman, the monkey god. He has a tail. It's not something he needs to hide. It's a source of power. In the Ramayana, his tail is set on fire, and he uses it to burn the city of Lanka. His tail is a divine tool, not a sign of disgrace. Devotees don't see him as less than human. He's a protector, a symbol of devotion, strength, and courage. Stories like these suggest a very different way of thinking about tails. Not simply as evidence of regression, but as a bridge between realms, between human and animal, between earthly and supernatural. In some Southeast Asian stories, Naga, serpent beings with long, sinuous bodies and sometimes human faces, guard rivers, treasures, and sacred places. They don't have mammal tails, but their elongated bodies carry the same idea, a form that bends away from standard human shape, signaling that this is something beyond ordinary. Even in Japanese yokai art, demons and spirits with tails aren't always evil. They're tricksters, shapeshifters, liminal beings that live in the spaces between categories. Their tails are part of what sets them free from human limits. So in one part of the world, a tail marks you as fallen. In another, it can mark you as divine. And yet, even today, in the age of genetics and anatomy textbooks, we still can't quite let the idea go. Modern fiction is full of humans with tails. Think of anime characters with sleek feline tails twitching with emotion. Comic book heroes and villains swinging from buildings with prehensile tails that work like extra hands. Fantasy races in games and novels, their tails swaying behind them to show mood more clearly than their faces. There's something strangely appealing about the thought. We imagine ourselves with tails that help us balance, fight, climb, express joy or anger without saying a word. We invent characters whose tails reveal what their mouths won't admit. Nervousness in a subtle flick. Confidence in a slow, relaxed wave. Even medical case reports. Rare children born with soft, fleshy appendages doctors sometimes call true human tails capture huge public attention. The science is clear, they're not full functional primate tails. They're developmental glitches, harmless in most cases, surgically removed. But the fascination isn't really medical, it's symbolic. Each one is like a ghost from deep time, a physical reminder that the boundary between tailed and tailless is written in biology, not just in myth. On some level, we seem to know that the line between animal and human isn't as sharp as older stories claimed. Our genes, our bones, our embryonic tails all testify to that. So our culture negotiates this tension in symbols. A devil's tail says, "Here is what you must never become." Hanuman's tail says, "Here is what you might aspire to be." A fox spirit's tails say, "Here is what lies beyond ordinary human understanding." A superhero's tale says, "Here is what evolution might have given us, in another branch of the tree." Underneath all of it is a quiet psychological truth. The tail we lost is more than just a missing limb. It represents the parts of ourselves we're never fully sure about, our instincts, our appetites, our connection to the rest of the animal world. For much of our history, we tried to push those things away, to pretend they were separate from what makes us human. We gave them to demons and monsters, banished them to forests and underworlds, tied them to tails and horns and fangs. But at the same time, in other stories, we honored them. We wrapped them in gold and incense, gave them divine titles, made them guardians and heroes. We knew, even if we couldn't say it clearly, that whatever we call human grew out of something older. That our minds, our languages, our civilizations are built on bodies shaped by millions of years of animal life. Your tail is gone, but the idea of it keeps returning. In nightmares and holy texts, in children's cartoons and Gothic paintings. It follows us not from behind, but from within. It's the reminder that being human is always a balancing act, between beast and angel, between instinct and reason, between the spine we have and the tail we left behind. Now drift forward, away from fossil beds and ancient savannas, into a bright, humming laboratory lit by computer screens and cold white LEDs. On one of those screens is your spine, not as an X-ray, but as a string of letters. A, C, G, T, the genetic recipe for the column of bone that holds you upright. Somewhere in that code are the instructions that tell your body, very early in development, start a tail, now stop, now erase almost all of it. And the unsettling thing is, we're starting to find those instructions. Over the past few decades, geneticists have been quietly taking our tail story apart, letter by letter. They've found stretches of DNA that control how many vertebrae form, switches that tell cells when to grow outward, when to fuse, when to self-destruct. Some of those switches are still active in tailed mammals. In us, many have been broken, muted, or rewired. This is where the science fiction part stops being fiction. Because with modern genetic tools like CRISPR, scientists don't just read DNA anymore. They can reach in and change it, turn a switch back on, silence a mutation, copy a healthy sequence from one animal and paste it into another. In theory, and it really is theory for now, we could take what we've learned from tailed primates and ask, what if we restored some of those tail-building instructions in humans? What if we reversed, in a controlled way, the genetic changes that helped our ancestors lose their tails 20 million years ago? It sounds wild, but in other animals, researchers are already nudging that line. In mice, the story is especially eerie. Mice are natural tail-bearers, but by tinkering with just a few genes, some that affect the patterning of the spine, others that influence cell death in the developing embryo. Scientists have made mouse strains with shorter tails, kinked tails, or almost no tail at all. In some experiments, adjusting those same pathways in the opposite direction can lengthen or morph tail structures. One study took a gene variant believed to be part of the ape tail loss story and introduced a similar change in mice. The result? Mice with drastically shortened tails, echoing in miniature what happened in our own lineage. Other experiments have shown that shifting when and where certain developmental genes turn on can add or subtract vertebrae like beads on a string. We're not growing full prehensile monkey tails in lab mice, but we are learning that tail length is not magic, it's a tunable feature, a developmental dial. Once you realize that, another question starts to whisper at the edge of consciousness, especially in a late-night lab or a sleepless bedroom. If we could do this in mice, how far are we from doing it in ourselves? Technically, the obstacles are huge. Human development is far more complex. Editing an embryo to grow a tail would mean rewriting programs that also affect nerves, muscles, even the spinal cord itself. One wrong change, and you don't just get a tail. You get paralysis, tumors, or lethal birth defects. Every gene involved in tail growth has multiple jobs. They don't just sculpt the end of the spine, they help pattern the entire body. So for now, the idea of a genetically engineered, fully functional human tail belongs firmly in the realm of speculative thought experiments. But the more serious barrier isn't technological, it's ethical. Even if one day we understood the genetics perfectly, there's a deeper question. Why would we do this? To cure disease, or to satisfy curiosity, to correct a disability, or to create a new kind of body just because we can? Modern bioethics moves slowly, cautiously, especially around changes that affect every cell of a future person. Editing an embryo to avoid a fatal illness is already controversial. Editing one so that child will be born with a tail, an irreversible, visible, socially charged alteration, would open conflicts we're barely prepared to think about. Would a tailed child be celebrated as a step toward a new phase of human evolution, or treated as a medical mistake, a curiosity, an outcast? In sleep-softened imagination, those questions can feel distant, almost abstract, but they're close cousins of debates we're already having today about cosmetic surgery, genetic enhancement, and body autonomy. Each new tool forces us to ask not only can we, but who decides, and what kind of future are we building, one body at a time. While genetic engineering creeps cautiously along those fault lines, a different, quieter movement has been answering the tail question in a completely different way. Not through DNA, but through design. All around the world, people are starting to wear tails, not the bones and muscle kind, soft, synthetic, playful ones. Cosplayers, performance artists, members of subcultures that treat the human body as a canvas rather than a finished product. Some tails are simple strips of fabric, others are elaborate, motorized devices that sway when you walk, curl when you sit, twitch when you're excited. Engineers have started joining in too. A few research groups have built robotic balance tails that strap to the waist and act like an extra counterweight. In early trials, they help wearers stay stable on uneven ground or carry heavy loads with less strain on the back. A kind of external, optional tail. A tool, not a birthright. These prosthetic tails are voluntary. You choose when to wear them, when to take them off. They don't alter your DNA. But they hint at a strange future where humans experiment with add-on body parts the way we once experimented with clothing and jewelry. And beneath all the fashion and fun, they reveal something deeper. For some reason, the idea of having a tail still pulls at us. We imagine leaping across rocks with better balance, sitting with a soft, warm appendage curled around our feet, expressing emotions with a swish instead of a word. There's a quiet nostalgia there, even though none of us has ever had a tail in the way a cat or a monkey does. Our fascination with regaining tails, whether through genes or gadgets or costume, is a kind of homesickness for a place we never consciously knew. A faint awareness that our bodies are not fixed, perfect things, but works in progress shaped by decisions our ancestors' genes made long before our first breath. When we picture ourselves with tails again, we are really doing two things at once. We are looking backward, toward the forests and branches where our primate relatives still practice the art of tail use we abandoned long ago. And we are looking forward, toward a future where humans may take evolution into their own hands, adding, subtracting, and redesigning themselves in ways natural selection never tried. Somewhere between those two directions, in that tension between what we were and what we might become, lies the real question. Not whether we could grow our tails back, but what it means that we keep wondering. Because the ghost of the tail in your spine is not just a biological curiosity. It's a reminder that your body is a story still being written. So now, at the quiet end of all this, lie back for a moment and trace the path we've just walked. From the first lobe-finned fish testing muddy shorelines 350 million years ago, to tree-leaping primates with magnificent balancing tails, to the strange gamble of becoming tailless apes, and finally to you, lying here with a spine that still remembers, because that's what your body is, a memory device. Every vertebra in your backbone is a sentence in a story that started long before humans, long before mammals, long before forests. Inside your DNA, there are echoes of every ancestor that ever carried a tail. Fish using it as a propeller, early reptiles using it as a counterweight, monkeys using it as a fifth hand, apes losing it and paying the price with aching backs and fragile discs. Your coccyx, those tiny fused bones at the base of your spine, is the full stop at the end of that 350 million year chapter. It's the scar where a tail used to be, the ghost limb of your lineage. Every time you stand upright without falling forward, you're cashing in on a trade-off evolution made on your behalf. And every time your lower back throbs after a long day, you're feeling the interest on that debt, the faint complaint of a tail that vanished millions of years ago. If this journey kept your mind gently busy while you drifted towards sleep, or if you learned something new about the body you live in, you can help this little corner of the internet survive by tapping like and subscribing so you don't miss the next story. When you're awake and ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. A city apartment, a dorm room, a night shift break room, a farmhouse on the edge of nowhere. Our scattered watching mirrors those tiny ancient bands, spread across the world but still connected. And if you ever feel like going one step further, there's a membership option here on YouTube. It's a way to support these long, careful stories if you're able and willing. But it's completely optional. Your presence, your time, your curiosity are already more than enough. For now, just notice your breathing, the weight of your body, the gentle curve of your spine against the bed. Somewhere deep inside those bones is the memory of a tale, and of all the ancestors who carried it so that you could be here, tonight, listening at the end of their story.